In the deepest halls of Gringotts, there was once a vault that opened without a key, and for years the goblins spoke of it only in whispers. Good evening, dear listener. I am Professor Salamander, and tonight I invite you into a mystery hidden beneath layers of stone, gold, and forgotten promises. Some secrets are buried to protect treasures, while others are buried to protect the world itself. So settle in, let the lanterns dim, and step quietly into the darkness with me. The war had ended, and yet the world of magic had not settled into the quiet peace that so many had hoped for, because even after the fall of Lord Voldemort, there remained shadows that no wand could simply banish, and among those shadows stood the ancient stone halls of Gringotts Wizarding Bank, unchanged, unyielding, and as secretive as ever. Deep beneath the crooked shops of Diagon Alley, the vaults of Gringotts stretched further than most witches and wizards could imagine, twisting through the earth like veins of iron and gold, guarded not only by dragons and curses, but by something older, something woven into the very will of the goblins who had built the bank long before any ministry decree had ever been written. It began, as many dangerous things do, with something small enough to be dismissed. A vault door opened. No alarms rang, no dragons stirred, no goblin guards raised their voices in alarm. And yet when the morning audit was conducted by the sharp-eyed clerks who prided themselves on noticing even the smallest inconsistency, it was discovered that Vault 712 had been breached during the night, though no record existed of any key, wand, or goblin authorization being used. The contents remained untouched. That, more than anything, unsettled the goblins. Within hours, the highest-ranking officials of Gringotts gathered in a chamber carved from black stone, their voices low and tense, their long fingers tapping against polished tables as they debated what could not easily be explained, because Gringotts was not merely a bank, it was a fortress of certainty, and certainty had just been broken. By midday, a message had been sent to the Ministry of Magic, and by evening, someone had been chosen to investigate. His name was Adrian Rowell, a junior investigator in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, whose duties rarely extended beyond paperwork, misplaced artifacts, and the occasional dispute over cursed heirlooms. And yet as he stood before the towering marble steps of Gringotts, watching the goblins move with their usual precision and silence, he felt the unmistakable weight of something far beyond his experience pressing quietly against his thoughts. He had been told very little. A breach. No signs of entry. No theft. And one instruction that had been repeated twice, as though repetition might somehow make it less troubling. Do not interfere with goblin procedures. Adrian adjusted his coat, took a breath, and stepped forward. Inside, the great hall of Gringotts gleamed with cold brilliance, the high ceilings reflecting the light of enchanted chandeliers, while rows of goblins worked behind their counters, scratching quills across parchment with methodical care, barely acknowledging the presence of customers, and certainly not the presence of a ministry investigator. He was met by a goblin whose expression revealed nothing, whose dark eyes seemed to measure him in a single glance, before turning sharply toward the private corridors beyond the main hall. This way, the goblin said, his voice clipped, controlled. Adrian followed without question. They descended quickly, bypassing the public carts, and instead entering a narrower passage where the air grew colder, heavier, and faintly metallic. As though the stone itself remembered something it did not wish to share, and after several turns that Adrian knew he could never retrace alone, they reached a chamber guarded by two silent goblins, standing as still as statues. The door opened. Inside, the vault lay exposed. Vault 7. 112 stood ajar. Its massive door swung inward just enough to reveal darkness beyond, and yet nothing about it suggested violence or force, because there were no scorch marks, no shattered locks, no lingering trace of magic that Adrian could detect, only the quiet, impossible fact that it had been opened. "Show me," Adrian said carefully. A goblin stepped forward, producing a thin silver instrument that hummed faintly as it passed over the vault's surface, and after a moment, he shook his head. "No spellwork," he said. "No keys?" No goblin access recorded." Adrian frowned, stepping closer, feeling an unease settle into his chest as he reached out, almost without thinking, and placed his hand against the cold metal of the vault door. For a brief, flickering instant, something shifted. Not in the room, not in the air, but somewhere deeper, as though far beneath his feet, something had stirred, something ancient and patient, something that had been waiting not for years, but for centuries. He pulled his hand away. "What is this vault used for?" he asked, his voice quieter now. The goblins exchanged a glance. And for the first time since he had arrived, Adrian saw something close to hesitation pass between them. "This vault," the lead goblin said slowly, "is not listed in your ministry records." Adrian felt his pulse quicken. "Then list it for me." A pause followed, long enough to feel deliberate, before the goblin spoke again, his tone measured, precise. "Vault 712 is classified under a designation known only to Goblin Command." Adrian held his ground. "And that designation is?" The goblin's gaze did not waver. "Zero clearance." The words settled heavily in the air, as though they carried a meaning that extended far beyond their simplicity. And though Adrian did not yet understand what they implied, he knew, with a certainty that made his breath tighten, that he had just stepped into something far more dangerous than a simple breach. Because somewhere below them, in the depths of Gringotts, something had awakened. And it had begun by opening a door. Adrian did not speak at once, because the phrase hung between them with such unnatural weight that even the scrape of a goblin's boot against the stone floor seemed, for a passing moment, like an intrusion into something that ought to have remained unspoken. And while he had entered Gringotts expecting secrecy, procedure, and perhaps even a measure of contempt from those who distrusted ministry interference, he had not expected to discover that there existed beneath the bank an entire class of vaults whose very names were absent from every official record he had ever studied. The lead goblin watched him without blinking, as though judging not only his reaction, but the speed with which his mind moved behind it. And when Adrian finally drew breath, steadying himself before speaking, he chose his next words with great care, because he knew at once that a wrong tone, a hasty demand, or even a single hint of arrogance would close whatever narrow door had just been opened. "If the ministry was summoned," he said, his voice calm and measured, "then either you want help or you want a witness when this becomes impossible to conceal, and in either case I need to know what a zero-clearance vault truly is." The goblin's eyes narrowed a fraction, though whether in irritation or reluctant respect Adrian could not tell, and for several long seconds there was no answer except the distant dripping of water somewhere in the tunnels beyond the chamber, until at last the goblin inclined his head, not in agreement, but in acceptance of necessity. "My name is Ragnarok," he said. "You will address me directly, and you will repeat nothing outside these walls without our approval." Adrian gave a short nod. "Then tell me." "Oh," Ragnarok turned toward the open vault, and for the first time Adrian noticed that even the other goblins standing nearest to it kept a certain distance, as though proximity itself were discouraged by custom older than memory. And when Ragnok spoke again, his voice had lowered, becoming not warmer but heavier, touched by the cold gravity of inherited caution. "Most vaults in Gringotts hold wealth," he said. "Some hold heirlooms, wills, blood contracts, or magical objects whose value lies in rarity. A zero-clearance vault holds something else. It holds what cannot be safely owned." Adrian felt the chill of the chamber settle deeper into his bones. "Confiscated objects?" "No," said Ragnok, and that single word, though quietly spoken, carried enough finality to stop further guesswork. "Contained objects." The difference was small in language, and enormous in meaning. Adrian looked again at the dark opening in the vault door, and now it seemed less like a place where treasure had been stored, and more like the mouth of a tunnel that had once been sealed for the good of everyone above it. What was in this one? Ragnok did not answer at once, because another goblin had stepped from the inner shadows of the vault, carrying a narrow case of black iron bound in silver wire, and though the case appeared intact, the expression on the goblin's face was grim enough to make Adrian's pulse rise before a word was spoken. "It is empty," the goblin said. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as though the chamber itself had drawn a sharp breath and held it. Ragnok strode forward, took the iron case in both hands, and inspected the broken seals along its rim, which Adrian now saw were not broken by force, but unfastened with terrible precision, as though whatever had opened them had understood not merely how to do so, but how to do so without disturbing a single thread of the surrounding enchantment. "What was inside?" Adrian asked. Ragnok's mouth tightened. "A key." Adrian stared at him. "A key to what?" "That," said Ragnok, turning his dark gaze fully upon him, "is the question that should concern us all." For a long moment, Adrian said nothing, because he had spent enough time around magical investigations to know the difference between a stolen object and a stolen function, and a missing key, especially one hidden in a secret vault beneath Gringotts, was never important for what it was made of, but for what it allowed someone to reach. "Who knew it was here?" he asked. "Very few." "How few?" Ragnok hesitated, and Adrian understood at once that numbers mattered here. "7, the goblin said at last. 6 goblins of command, and now you." The implication struck Adrian like cold water. "Then one of the 6... Ragnok's hand slammed flat against the iron case with a crack that echoed through the chamber. "Choose your next sentence wisely." The warning was not loud, but it was real. Adrian kept his composure, though only just, and inclined his head. "I meant only that secrecy narrows the field." "It does," said Ragnok, "and that is why none of us have slept." The silence that followed was broken by the faint tremor beneath Adrian's feet, so slight that he might have mistaken it for imagination had he not seen the nearest goblin glance sharply toward the tunnel beyond the vault, where the rails vanished into darkness. "Did you feel that?" Adrian asked. Ragnok did not deny it. "Yes." "What was it?" Instead of answering, the goblin moved toward the doorway and gestured for Adrian to follow, and together they stepped into a side passage that ended at a narrow stone balcony overlooking a shaft so deep that the lanterns fixed to its walls vanished long before the bottom could be seen, while from far below came the slow, grinding sound of ancient mechanisms turning after a silence far too long to be natural. Adrian stared downward. "What is beneath us?" Ragnok answered without flourish. the lower vault grid. And the missing key opened something there. No, said Ragnok, and once again the correction was worse than the assumption. The missing key allows passage through it. Adrian's throat tightened. Passage to what? Ragnok looked down into the black shaft, and when he spoke, his voice had changed, carrying not secrecy now, but a kind of inherited dread. To the foundation chambers. Adrian had never heard the term before, yet he understood immediately that he was not meant to have done, because some names explained themselves by the fear with which they were spoken, and as he stood on that balcony with the breathless dark below him and the heavy stone of Gringotts all around, he began to see the true shape of the matter before him. This was not a robbery. This was not even a breach. Someone had entered a secret vault, removed a key that should not have been touched, and awakened machinery buried beneath the bank. Machinery connected to chambers so old that the goblins themselves spoke of them like a wound under bandages, which meant that whoever had done this knew exactly where to go, exactly what to take, and exactly what consequence would follow. Then the conflict is simple, Adrian said quietly, more to himself than to Ragnok, though the goblin heard him all the same. Find the key, find who took it, and stop them before they reach the foundation chambers. Ragnok turned his gaze on him, and in that hard look Adrian saw something darken rather than ease. If only it were so simple, the goblin said. Then he lifted one long finger and pointed downward into the shaft. At first Adrian saw nothing, because the darkness below was thick and shifting, touched only faintly by distant lantern glow, but after a few seconds his eyes caught movement along the rails, far beneath them, where a cart was climbing from the deep on its own, with no driver seated within it, no goblin operating the brakes, and no visible magic pulling it upward through the black. The cart rose steadily, grinding along the rails with unnatural certainty until it reached the level below the balcony and passed through a pool of lantern light. Inside it lay a second iron case, and fastened to its lid, in a line of silver letters that seemed almost to shine with malice, were the words, "Zero clearance, opened." Before Adrian could speak, before Ragnok could issue an order, before any of them could do more than stare, something inside the case began to knock from within. For one long and dreadful instant, neither Adrian nor the goblins moved, because the sound was so deliberate, so measured, and so horribly calm that it seemed less like the frantic struggle of some trapped creature, and more like the patient signal of an intelligence that knew it was being heard. And as the cart continued to rise upon the iron rails with that black case trembling faintly upon its bed of chains, the narrow shaft around them seemed to contract into a throat of stone through which something old and unwelcome was forcing its return. Then Ragnok gave an order in gobbledygook so sharp and rapid that Adrian did not understand a single word of it, though he needed no translation to grasp its urgency. Because the two goblins nearest the shaft leapt at once into motion, drawing hooked instruments from their belts and striking them against bronze plates fixed to the wall, whereupon the sound that rang out was not like a bell at all, but like the splitting note of metal under strain, harsh enough to set Adrian's teeth on edge and echoing downward into the dark like a warning sent into the bones of the bank itself. The cart halted at once. Not gradually, not with the squeal of brakes, but with a suddenness so absolute that Adrian's first thought was that the rails themselves had seized it by command. The knocking from inside the iron case ceased. That silence was worse. Ragnok descended the spiral steps to the lower landing with a speed Adrian would not have expected from his compact frame, and Adrian followed without waiting to be told, because whatever agreement existed between goblins and ministry officials, it had already given way to the plain, immediate reality that something impossible was moving through Gringotts with intent. And if he stayed back now, he would learn nothing except how quickly events could outrun him. By the time he reached the lower platform, 4 more goblins had arrived from adjoining tunnels, each wearing dark leather coats fitted with narrow plates of enchanted metal, and each carrying a weapon Adrian had never seen before, for they resembled neither wand nor blade, but some hybrid of both, their polished handles inset with tiny runes that glowed like embers. "No one opens it," Ragnok said. No goblin challenged him. The black case sat in the cart no more than 6 feet away, its silver binding wires intact, its lid marked with that same dreadful inscription. And though Adrian had expected the thing inside to begin pounding once more, it remained still, as though it had heard the command and chosen, for reasons of its own, to wait. "What sends sealed cases upward from the lower grid?" Adrian asked, keeping his voice low. "Nothing should," said Ragnok. "That is not an answer. It is the only one I have." Adrian stepped nearer the cart, ignoring the flash of irritation in one goblin's eyes, and crouched enough to examine the wheels, the underframe, the rail clamps, any visible sign that a hand or spell had tampered with them. Yet everything appeared intact, grimly ordinary even, except for the thin frost that coated the underside of the case, though the air in the shaft was not nearly cold enough to explain it. He reached toward it. Ragnok caught his wrist before his fingers touched the metal. "Do not be stupid." Adrian looked up at him without pulling away. "If I cannot inspect it, then you inspect it and tell me what I need to know." For a moment it seemed Ragnok might simply order him out of the shaft, but then the goblin released his wrist and signaled to one of the armored guards, who stepped forward with a narrow rod of hammered gold and passed it slowly along the case's edges, whereupon the runes on the rod flared blue, then green, then abruptly blackened all at once as though scorched from within. The goblin hissed and dropped it. The rod struck the stone, bent in the middle, and began to smoke. No one spoke. Adrian stared. "What kind of magic does that?" Ragnok's expression had become colder still, and Adrian now saw that beneath the goblin's control there was something far more alarming than anger, which was fear held in such tight discipline that it had become almost invisible. "Not charm work," Ragnok said. "Not curse work. Recognition." Adrian frowned. "Recognition of what?" Ragnok looked at the case as though he loathed the answer. "Of authority." That landed heavily enough to still even Adrian's next breath, because he understood at once what such a system implied, and more importantly, what it did not. For if the case had traveled upward under recognized authority from chambers that should have remained sealed, then whoever had moved below the bank had not fought their way through goblin protections like a thief, but had been acknowledged by them in some fashion, whether by name, by blood, by possession of the missing key, or by something stranger still. The vault was opened cleanly, Adrian murmured, thinking aloud now, his mind racing to keep pace. The seals on the first case were unfastened, not broken. The lower system responds as though proper clearance has been granted. Which means the intruder is not bypassing Gringotts. He rose slowly, meeting Ragnok's eyes. They are being let through. The goblin did not contradict him. Before Adrian could press further, the case gave a single hard knock from within, louder than before, and at once every weapon in the hands of the goblin guards lifted a fraction. Then came a second knock. Then a third. Not random. Not frantic. A pattern. Adrian listened head tilted slightly, because there was something maddeningly familiar in the spacing, though he could not place it at once. And then, as the sound repeated, realization struck him with such force that he spoke before caution could stop him. "It's counting." Ragnok turned sharply. "What?" "It's not knocking blindly," Adrian said. "It's counting in sequences." The case fell silent, as though listening. Then, with chilling obedience, it knocked again. 1. Pause. 2. Pause. 3. Longer pause. Then 1, 2, 3, 4. A goblin guard swore under his breath in his own language. Adrian's stomach tightened. "It knows we noticed." That was when the lanterns in the shaft flickered. One by one, the lights set into the stone walls dimmed, recovered, dimmed again, and then, far below, a red glow began to pulse faintly through the darkness, too deep to illuminate shapes clearly, yet strong enough to stain the lower air with the color of banked fire. While from the tunnels branching off the landing, there arose a sound Adrian had not heard before, a slow metallic unsealing, like locks the size of gates drawing back under orders issued from the center of the earth. Ragnok spun toward one of the guards. Status. The goblin pressed a palm-sized disc against the wall, waited, then recoiled as the metal in the stone heated bright enough to burn. "Containment doors are opening," he said, "sequentially, downward and east." "How many?" The guard's face went tight. "All of them." The words struck harder than a shouted alarm could have done, because Adrian understood that this was movement with direction, not chaos, which meant the unknown force below wasn't merely awakening dormant systems, but choosing a route through them. And if the missing key granted passage into the foundation chambers, then every door opening in sequence could be part of a single deliberate descent. "Can you override it?" Adrian asked. Ragnok's answer came without hesitation. If override were possible, we would not have summoned the ministry. Whoa, there it was at last, the admission stripped of pride, and Adrian felt the shape of the conflict sharpen fully in his mind, because the mystery was no longer whether something had gone wrong, but whether they could descend into the oldest and most secret levels of Gringotts before whoever held the key reached the one place they must never be allowed to reach. The case in the cart gave another series of knocks. This time Adrian understood the pattern at once, and the understanding turned his blood cold. It was not counting upward now. It was marking floors. 1, 2, 3. Then a pause long enough to suggest arrival. Ragnok saw the change in Adrian's face. "What is it?" Adrian looked toward the red glow far below. "It is not warning us," he said quietly. "It is telling us where they are." Before Ragnok could respond, the latches on the black case sprang open of their own accord with a crack like splitting ice. The lid rose half an inch, and from the narrow seam there spilled not light, not smoke, but a thin stream of glittering golden dust that hung in the air before shaping itself into the unmistakable outline of a goblin hand. One finger extended, pointing straight down into the depths beneath Gringotts. The golden dust did not fall, nor did it drift as ordinary particles would have done, because it held its form with an unsettling precision that suggested not illusion, but intent. And as the slender shape of the goblin hand hovered above the half-open case, unwavering in its downward gesture, Adrian felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with fear alone, but rather with the dawning realization that whatever system had been awakened beneath Gringotts was not merely active, but communicative, and worse still, it was choosing to reveal itself. No one spoke at first, because even the goblin guards, whose discipline had not wavered through alarms and breaches, now watched the hovering dust with a caution that bordered on reverence, as though they were witnessing not a trick or a threat, but a signal drawn from the oldest laws that governed their kind. And when at last Ragnok stepped forward, his voice was low and strained beneath its control. "This is not meant for you," he said, not to Adrian, but to the hand itself. The dust did not respond. It continued to point downward, unwavering, patient. Adrian forced himself to think, to hold on to reason despite the mounting weight of the moment, because he understood that panic would serve nothing here, and that the only way forward lay in interpreting what was being shown, rather than recoiling from it. "It opened the vault," he said quietly, more to Ragnok than to himself. "It released the key, and now it is guiding us." "Guiding?" one of the guards repeated sharply. "Or luring?" Adrian did not answer at once, because both possibilities were equally dangerous, and yet he could not ignore the pattern that had already emerged, for the vault had not been destroyed, the seals had not been broken, and even this second case had not burst apart with violence, but had instead opened with deliberate precision, as though following a sequence established long before any of them had been born. "It wants to be followed," Adrian said at last. Ragnok's gaze hardened. "Everything that wants to be followed has a reason. And everything that hides its path has a worse one," Adrian replied, meeting his eyes without hesitation, because he knew that the moment demanded clarity rather than caution. "You said these vaults contain what cannot be safely owned, which means whoever designed this system expected something like this to happen. And if that is true, then this is not chaos. It is a process." The golden hand flickered slightly, as though stirred by a current of air that none of them could feel. And then, with a motion so smooth it seemed almost alive, it shifted its angle, pointing no longer straight downward, but toward a tunnel branching off from the lower landing, a tunnel that Adrian had not noticed before, because its entrance was partially concealed by a curved wall of black stone that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the lantern light. Ragnok followed the gesture, and for a brief moment something like recognition passed across his face, though it vanished almost at once beneath his usual composure. "That passage," he said slowly, "was sealed." Adrian turned toward it, studying the narrow opening now revealed by the dust's indication, and he saw at once that the stone around it bore the faint, etched outlines of ancient wards, not the intricate rune work of modern enchantment, but something older and more severe, patterns cut deep into the rock itself, as though they had been carved not to decorate, but to bind. "Was," Adrian repeated. Ragnok gave a single curt nod. The implication was clear. If the passage had been sealed and was now accessible, then whatever force was moving below had already passed through it, which meant that every delay here allowed it to move further into regions that even the goblins regarded with caution. And as that realization settled, Adrian felt the urgency sharpen into something immediate and undeniable. "We go after it," he said. A murmur of objection rose from the guards, but Ragnok silenced them with a raised hand, his eyes still fixed on the tunnel as though weighing not only the risk, but the necessity. "If we descend without authority," one guard said, his voice tight with controlled alarm, "we break laws older than the ministry itself." "If we do not descend," Adrian answered, turning toward him, "then whatever is below will reach the foundation chambers unchecked, and I doubt those laws were written to protect that outcome." The guard fell silent. Ragnok exhaled slowly, and for the first time since Adrian had met him, the goblin's composure seemed to strain against something deeper, something rooted not in present danger, but in memory, in tradition, in the long-held understanding of what lay beneath their feet and why it had been sealed away. "You do not understand what you are asking," Ragnok said. "Then make me understand while we move," Adrian replied, because he knew that hesitation would only deepen the danger, and that whatever explanation lay behind these vaults, it could not outweigh the immediate need to act. The golden hand shifted again, its outline beginning to fray at the edges, as though the force sustaining it was weakening, and for a moment Adrian feared that whatever guidance it offered would vanish before they could follow it. But then, with a final, precise motion, it pointed once more toward the hidden passage, holding there as if to mark the path one last time. Then it collapsed. The dust fell, scattering across the stone floor, losing all form and purpose in an instant, leaving behind only the open case and the echo of its silent command. Ragnok turned sharply. "We move," he said. The decision, once made, was executed without delay, because the goblins fell into formation with a discipline that spoke of centuries of preparation for dangers such as this. And within moments the small group had entered the narrow passage, their lanterns casting long, shifting shadows against walls that seemed to press closer the deeper they went, until the sounds of the main shaft faded entirely, replaced by a silence so complete that even Adrian's breathing felt intrusive. The air changed as they descended, growing colder and thinner, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that reminded Adrian of old coins and older blood. And as the tunnel curved and sloped downward, he began to notice that the stone underfoot was no longer smooth, but ridged, etched with patterns that matched the ancient wards at the entrance, though here they were deeper, sharper, as though meant not merely to seal, but to direct. "Tracks," Adrian murmured. Ragnok glanced at him. "Not for carts," Adrian continued, running his gaze along the lines carved into the floor. "For something else." Ragnok did not answer, which in itself was an answer. They moved faster. The tunnel narrowed, then widened abruptly into a chamber whose ceiling arched high above them, supported by pillars carved into shapes that Adrian could not fully make out because their surfaces were worn and darkened by time. Yet there was something unmistakably deliberate in their arrangement, as though they had been placed not for strength alone, but for alignment, forming a pattern that extended beyond the visible walls. At the far end of the chamber stood a door, not a vault door like those above, but something older, heavier, its surface unmarked by numbers or names, yet covered in the same deep carved symbols that lined the passage. And as Adrian stepped closer, he felt again that subtle shift beneath his feet. The same tremor he had noticed before, only stronger now, as though whatever moved below was drawing nearer. Or perhaps they were drawing nearer to it. "This leads further down," Adrian said. Ragnok inclined his head. "Yes." "And it was sealed." "Yes." Adrian reached out, stopping just short of the door because he could feel the faint hum of magic within it. Not active, not resisting, but waiting, like a lock that had already been opened, yet had not yet been pushed aside. "Then whoever took the key has already passed through here." Ragnok's gaze hardened. "Yes." Adrian looked back at the group, at the guards whose weapons were ready, at the narrow passage behind them that now seemed impossibly distant, and then once more at the door that stood between them and whatever lay beneath Gringotts. "The conflict is clear," he said quietly, the words grounding him even as the air grew colder around them. "We follow, we find them, and we stop them before they reach whatever the Foundation chambers are meant to protect." Ragnok stepped forward, placing his hand against the ancient stone. "And if we fail," he said, his voice low and final, "there will be nothing left above us to protect." With that, he pushed. The door opened without resistance. And from the darkness beyond came a sound that made every goblin in the chamber stiffen at once, because it was not the grind of stone or the hiss of old magic, but the slow, deliberate turning of something vast, something buried so deep that its movement should never have been heard at all. The sound did not cease when the door opened, because it continued to roll through the stone like the breath of something that had waited too long in silence. And as Adrian crossed the threshold behind Ragnok, he felt as though he were stepping not merely into a deeper chamber of the bank, but into a place that had been intentionally forgotten, a place that had never been meant for human eyes, and perhaps not even for goblin ones, except in the rarest and most dire of circumstances. The passage beyond was vast, far wider than the corridor they had descended. And its walls were not cut with the careful precision of modern stonework, but instead bore the marks of older tools, deeper strikes, and a craftsmanship that seemed to value permanence over refinement. And though lanterns had been set at intervals along the walls, their light was dimmer here, as though the very air resisted illumination, swallowing brightness and returning it in muted, uncertain echoes. Adrian moved carefully, his boots striking the stone with a sound that felt too loud in the oppressive quiet. And as he glanced at the floor, he saw that the carved lines had grown thicker, deeper, and more numerous, branching and converging in patterns that suggested not decoration, but direction, like a network of channels guiding something unseen through the bones of the earth. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Ragnok did not slow. "This is the first boundary of the Foundation grid," he said. "Beyond this point there are no vault numbers, no records, and no agreements with the Ministry, because what lies below was never intended to be catalogued." Adrian absorbed that in silence, because he understood now that whatever conflict they were moving to resolve, it existed entirely outside the systems he had been trained to trust, and that meant that every rule he had relied upon above ground would mean very little here. They advanced through the chamber until the passage split into 3 descending tunnels, each marked by a series of vertical grooves carved into the stone beside them, though the grooves differed subtly in number and spacing, as though they represented not directions, but classifications. And as Adrian studied them, he realized with a faint chill that they resembled the counting pattern the case had tapped upon its lid. 3 routes, he said. Ragnok nodded once. 3 tiers. And the knocking, Adrian continued, his thoughts aligning rapidly now. It was not just counting, it was indicating sequence. Ragnok's gaze sharpened. "You believe the signal was telling us which path to take?" "I believe it was telling us how far ahead they are," Adrian said, turning slowly to face the tunnels, because something in the pattern felt incomplete, as though the answer lay not only in the number of knocks, but in the pauses between them, the rhythm itself forming a code that he was only beginning to grasp. He stepped toward the center tunnel, then hesitated, because though logic drew him there, instinct held him back, and in that moment he understood that whoever, or whatever, had created the signal had expected them to follow it, which meant the possibility of misdirection could not be ignored. "Wait," he said. Ragnok stopped. "What is it?" Adrian crouched, tracing the carved grooves with his fingers without quite touching them, his eyes narrowing as he measured the spacing, the depth, the slight variations that distinguished one path from another. And then, slowly, he rose again. "The middle path is too obvious," he said. "If the signal were meant to guide us directly, it would not need to be encoded." Ragnok studied the tunnels. "Then choose." Adrian looked from one to the other, weighing the pattern in his mind, recalling the sequence of knocks, the pauses, the shift at the end. And then, with a quiet certainty that surprised even him, he turned toward the leftmost passage. "This one," he said. There was a brief, tense silence, but Ragnok gave no objection, and with a sharp gesture he ordered the guards forward, their formation tightening as they entered the chosen tunnel, leaving the other two behind in darkness that seemed to deepen as they moved away. The air grew colder with every step. Not the natural chill of underground stone, but a biting, unnatural cold that seeped through cloth and skin alike, carrying with it a faint whispering sound that Adrian could not at first identify, though it lingered at the edge of hearing. Rising and falling like distant voices, speaking too softly to understand. "Do you hear that?" he asked. One of the guards nodded stiffly. "Always," the goblin said. The answer did not comfort him. They continued downward, the tunnel sloping more steeply now, until at last it opened into another chamber, smaller than the last but far more unsettling, because its walls were lined with narrow alcoves, each sealed by a thin plate of metal etched with symbols that pulsed faintly with a dull red glow. And as Adrian's eyes adjusted, he realized with a slow tightening of his breath that each alcove held something within it, shapes barely visible behind the plates, some still, some shifting ever so slightly as though aware of their presence. "Containment," Adrian whispered. Ragnok inclined his head. "Lower-tier holdings," he said. "Not zero clearance, but close enough that none are ever removed." Adrian stepped closer to one of the alcoves, peering through the narrow slit where the metal plate met the stone, and for a fleeting instant he thought he saw an eye staring back at him. Not human, not goblin, but something older, something that blinked once before vanishing into the darkness beyond the barrier. He stepped back at once. "Move," Ragnok said, his voice firm, because even he did not linger here. They crossed the chamber quickly, yet not so quickly that Adrian failed to notice the pattern repeating, the same carved lines on the floor, the same directional grooves near the exit, and as they passed through the far archway, he felt a faint tremor beneath his feet once more. Stronger now, more immediate, as though the movement below was no longer distant, but rising. "They are close," he said. Ragnok did not argue. The tunnel beyond curved sharply, descending in a tight spiral that forced them into single file, and as Adrian followed the flickering light of the goblin ahead of him, he became acutely aware of the sound that had begun to accompany their descent. A steady, rhythmic pulse that echoed faintly through the stone, not unlike the beating of a heart, though far slower, far heavier, and far too large to belong to any living creature he could imagine. "What is that?" he asked. Ragnok answered without turning. "The core mechanism." Adrian felt a chill run through him. "And it is active." "Yes." They reached the bottom of the spiral and emerged into a vast cavern unlike anything Adrian had ever seen, because it was not merely a chamber carved from stone, but a constructed space filled with enormous interlocking rings of metal that turned slowly within one another, each etched with the same ancient symbols he had seen throughout the tunnels. And at the center of it all stood a platform, connected by narrow bridges that stretched across the moving machinery like fragile threads. The sound he had heard now surrounded them completely. The turning of the rings, the pulse of the mechanism. the deep, resonant hum of something that had not moved for centuries and was now awakening piece by piece. On the far side of the platform, a figure stood. At first, Adrian thought it was a goblin because of its size and posture. But as the figure turned slightly, he saw at once that something was wrong, because the proportions were subtly off, the limbs too long, the movement too fluid. And though it wore what appeared to be goblin armor, it carried itself with a grace that did not belong to any creature he had seen within the bank. In its hand, it held a key. A small object, barely visible at this distance, and yet Adrian felt its presence as clearly as if it had been placed in his own palm, because the air around it seemed to bend, the light itself dimming and brightening in uneven pulses, as though reality struggled to remain stable in its presence. The figure began to move. Not toward them, but toward the center of the platform, where a second door stood, larger than any they had yet encountered, its surface covered entirely in the deep carved symbols of the foundation grid, glowing faintly now as the mechanism turned beneath it. Adrian's breath tightened. "They are about to open it," he said. Ragnar's voice came sharp and immediate. "Then we stop them." But even as he spoke, the key in the figure's hand began to glow. The light that rose from the key was not bright in the ordinary sense, because it did not flood the cavern or cast clean shadows upon the turning rings of metal, but instead gathered around the figure's hand in a dense and shifting radiance, pale at the center and dark at the edge, as though the glow were drawing light inward rather than giving it away. And when that strange illumination touched the great door at the center platform, the carved symbols upon its surface answered at once, awakening in narrow lines of red-gold fire that spread from mark to mark with dreadful precision until the entire height of the stone shimmered like a buried furnace being stoked after centuries of cold. "Move," Ragnar said, and this time there was no room in his voice for debate, because the conflict that had been forming through tunnels, vaults, codes, and silence had at last taken visible shape before them, and it was now terribly simple in its urgency, for if the figure reached the door and completed whatever rite or mechanism the key required, then whatever the foundation chambers were meant to contain would no longer remain contained. The goblin guards broke into motion across the narrow bridges with astonishing speed, their boots striking sparks from the metal where the turning rings passed beneath, while Adrian followed close behind, not because he believed himself equal to them in such a place, but because every instinct told him that the unknown figure ahead had not come this far to hesitate now, and that any pause on their part would leave them facing consequences too great to mend afterward. The cavern groaned around them as the rings turned. The bridges shuddered beneath their weight. The air thrummed with old machinery and older magic. Halfway across the first bridge, the figure on the far platform stopped and turned fully towards them at last, and Adrian felt his blood run cold, because though it was shaped like a goblin in height and frame, the face beneath the battered helm was not goblin at all, nor wizard, nor anything natural to his understanding, but a mask of pale hammered metal fitted close to a narrow skull, with eye slits dark as sealed keyholes, and a mouth carved into a fixed expression that was neither smile nor grimace, but something far worse in its stillness. The imitation of a face made by those who understood features without understanding life. One of the guards shouted and raised his weapon. A streak of blue-white force leapt across the gap. The figure moved with impossible swiftness, turning just enough that the blast struck the edge of the helm rather than the center, and though the metal rang like a bell struck in a tomb, the thing did not fall, did not stagger, and did not cry out, but instead lifted its free hand, whereupon the symbols carved into the bridge beneath the leading goblin flared crimson and burst upward in a wall of jagged light. The goblin was thrown backward. 2 others dropped low, barely avoiding the surge. Adrian seized the rail and held on as the bridge jolted so hard that his teeth clicked together. And for one wild moment he thought the entire structure beneath them would twist apart and drop them into the turning metal below, where the great rings ground against one another with enough force to crush stone into dust. "What is it?" Adrian shouted. Ragnarok answered while still moving, still advancing, his voice sharp with both fury and disbelief. "A ward keeper." The words meant little to Adrian at first, yet their tone meant enough, because he heard in them not recognition alone, but the horror of seeing something that should have remained hidden made active before his eyes. And when he looked again at the metal-faced figure, he noticed that the armor wasn't worn as clothing was worn, but fixed into the body itself, joined at shoulder and wrist by thin seams of gold that moved with it like tendons. "It is alive?" Adrian called. "No," said Ragnarok, and the answer was worse than the question. It was made. The figure turned again toward the foundation door. The key in its hand brightened. The symbols on the door answered in widening circles, each layer of carved marks unlocking another with a heavy grinding noise that rolled through the cavern like thunder under stone. Adrian's mind raced. A ward keeper. A maid guardian. A thing recognized by the system below Gringotts. Then the pattern shifted in his thoughts with sudden force, and he understood that they had perhaps misread the entire pursuit. "It did not steal the key," he shouted. "It was sent for it." Ragnarok stopped just long enough to look back at him, and in that single glance, Adrian saw the truth strike home. Because if the wardkeeper belonged to the Foundation grid itself, then the breach above had not been an intrusion from outside at all, but an internal command, ancient machinery waking, identifying its own servant, and granting passage through locked systems as though performing a function set in motion long ago. The conflict changed at once. This was no simple chase after a thief. This was a race to stop Gringotts from obeying itself. "Can you disable it?" Adrian asked. Ragnarok's expression was like iron. "If I could, it would already be broken." More. Another blast from the goblin weapon struck the wardkeeper, this time square in the chest, and though the force of it drove the creature back a step, the ancient armor absorbed most of the blow with a shower of red sparks, while the creature answered by striking the key against the door. The sound that followed was small, a mere click, and yet it traveled through the entire cavern like a command. The moving rings below them accelerated. The bridges lurched. From somewhere deep beneath the platform there came the unmistakable series of heavy locks, drawing back one after another in exact sequence. "No," Ragnarok said, and this time Adrian heard something close to fear break through the goblin's control. The foundation door began to part. Only an inch at first, then 2, then more. Opening inward along a seam so ancient and tight that the stone groaned in protest, while from the darkness beyond there spilled a wind colder than winter and dry as unopened tombs, carrying with it a faint glitter of golden dust, much like that which had risen from the black case before, only thicker now, denser, alive with a slow turning motion as though countless tiny metal fragments swam within it. The wardkeeper stepped aside. It was letting something out. Adrian's first clear view beyond the door lasted no more than a second, but it was enough to wrench the breath from him, because inside the chamber beyond he saw not treasure, not weapons, and not rows of contained objects, but a single enormous mechanism of black gold suspended above a circular shaft, turning with majestic slowness upon an axis of lightless crystal, while from its outer ring hung hundreds of keys, all different, all gleaming faintly as they moved. And around that impossible machine ran chains as thick as tree trunks, each one stretching down into the dark below, as though anchoring the device to something vast and unseen beneath the earth. "What is that?" Adrian whispered. Ragnar's answer came like a confession dragged unwillingly into the open. "The lock below." Adrian stared. "The Foundation chambers protect that?" "No," said Ragnar. His face had gone very still. "It protects us from what the lock below restrains." Those words had scarcely settled when the golden dust pouring from the doorway began to coil in the air above the platform, forming not a hand this time, but letters, huge and angular, written in gobbledygook, and then, as if translating itself for Adrian's benefit, changing shape before his eyes into English he could read. Clearance failed. The wardkeeper froze. The glowing key in its hand flared violently. The great mechanism beyond the door shuddered once, twice, and then all at once the hundreds of hanging keys upon its outer ring began to spin. Every goblin in the cavern went still. Ragnar's voice, when it came, was stripped bare of command and left with nothing but urgency. "Back," he said. "All of you back now." Oh, Adrian did not move. Not because he was brave, but because he saw something the others had not yet seen. At the base of the partially opened door, just where the seam met the platform floor, there was a second keyhole, smaller than the first, and almost invisible beneath the dust and ancient grime, and around it the stone bore a ring of scratches so fresh that the edges were still pale, as though the wardkeeper had tried the key there before using it above. It had chosen the wrong lock. "Ragnar," Adrian said, forcing his voice through the rising roar of the spinning keys. "It failed because this is not the door it was meant to open." The goblin turned. Adrian pointed. For the first time since the chase had begun, uncertainty crossed Ragnar's face not as fear, but as dawning realization. Then the wardkeeper moved again, and this time it wasn't turning toward the lock below. The moment the wardkeeper turned toward Adrian, the air itself seemed to tighten, as though the vast mechanism behind the half-opened door had shifted its attention along with the creature that served it, and the spinning keys within the lock below began to accelerate with a shrill metallic chorus that echoed through the cavern like a storm of blades colliding in the dark, while the golden dust thickened into a slow, spiraling cloud that hovered between the platform and the open threshold, as if forming a barrier or perhaps a boundary that had just been crossed. Adrian did not retreat. Not because he believed himself capable of facing what approached, but because he understood with a sudden, chilling clarity that he had already become part of the pattern unfolding here, and that the creature's attention was not random, but directed, drawn by something he had said or something he had realized, and in that awareness lay the only advantage he possessed. Ragnar stepped between them at once, his stance low and ready, the weapon in his hand glowing faintly as its embedded runes awakened in response to the rising power in the chamber. And the other goblin guards spread outward along the edge of the platform, forming a loose semicircle that cut off the wardkeeper's path without blocking their own line of retreat, because even in this moment of escalating danger, their discipline remained intact. "Do not engage unless I give the order," Ragnar said sharply. Though his eyes never left the advancing figure, the wardkeeper moved with the same fluid precision as before, stepping across the stone without haste, without hesitation, and without the smallest sign of strain, its metal face reflecting the dim light in dull, shifting fragments, while the key in its hand pulsed now with a deeper, more unstable glow that flickered between pale gold and a darker hue that seemed almost black at the edges, as though the object itself were responding to the failure that had just been declared. Adrian forced himself to speak, because silence would surrender the moment entirely. "It is reacting to the mistake," he said, his voice steady despite the tightening pressure in his chest. "It knows the key was used incorrectly." Ragnok did not look back. "It does not know," the goblin said. "It follows." The distinction was small, yet it struck Adrian with sudden force, because if the wardkeeper was not aware in the way a thinking creature was aware, then its actions were not choices, but responses, governed by rules embedded far deeper than intent, which meant that whatever it did next would not be unpredictable, but inevitable, if only those rules could be understood quickly enough. "It tried the main lock," Adrian continued, forcing his thoughts into order as the creature drew nearer. "When that failed, it turned to me." "Why?" one of the guards demanded. Adrian's answer came as the realization formed. "Because I noticed the second keyhole." The wardkeeper stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant grinding of the lock below and the relentless spin of its suspended keys. And in that stillness the creature raised its head slightly, as though aligning its gaze with Adrian's position not through sight, but through some deeper recognition. Ragnok's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. "Do not move." Adrian did not. The wardkeeper lifted its empty hand, and for a moment nothing happened, until the carved symbols along the edge of the platform flared to life in a thin line of crimson light that ran like fire along the stone between the creature and Adrian, stopping just short of his boots, marking a boundary that felt less like a barrier and more like a measurement. "It is scanning," Adrian said, the word strange on his tongue in a place like this, yet the only one that fit the precision of what he was witnessing. "For what?" Ragnok asked. Adrian swallowed. "For clearance." The word hung in the air with dreadful weight, because it connected too cleanly with everything they had seen: the designation of the vault, the behavior of the system, the failure of the key at the first lock, and the presence of a second, smaller mechanism that had gone unnoticed until the last moment. And as that pattern aligned, Adrian felt the shape of the conflict shift once more, narrowing into something far more specific and far more dangerous. The wardkeeper took another step. The crimson line advanced with it. Adrian felt a sudden pressure against his chest, not physical, but internal, as though something within him were being weighed, measured against an unseen scale, and for a brief, disorienting instant, he had the impression that the cavern itself was looking through him, searching for something that might or might not be there. Then, without warning, the pressure vanished. The crimson line flared brightly, then dimmed. The wardkeeper lowered its hand. "Clearance denied," Ragnok said quietly, reading the meaning without needing the words to appear again. Adrian exhaled slowly, only then realizing that he had been holding his breath. "So it cannot use me," he said. "No," Ragnok agreed, though his tone carried no relief. "But it knows you identified the correct lock." Adrian's stomach tightened. "And that matters." The wardkeeper turned, not back towards the main door, not toward the goblins. but toward the base of the threshold where the smaller keyhole lay hidden beneath dust and ancient stone. "It is going to try again," Adrian said. This time Ragnok did not hesitate. "Stop it." The command snapped through the chamber, and the goblin guards acted at once, their weapons discharging in rapid succession, bolts of concentrated force striking the wardkeeper from multiple angles, driving it back a step, then another, sparks and fragments of glowing runework bursting from its armor as the impacts landed with increasing force. For a moment, it seemed to falter. Then the key in its hand flared violently, and the creature drove the metal tip downward toward the hidden keyhole. Adrian moved without thinking. He lunged forward across the platform, ignoring Ragnok's shout, and threw himself toward the creature, not to attack, not to overpower, because he knew that was impossible, but to disrupt the motion. To break the alignment of key and lock by even the smallest margin. He collided with the wardkeeper just as the key descended. The impact was like striking a wall of iron, yet it was enough. The key missed. Instead of sliding cleanly into the hidden mechanism, it struck the edge of the stone with a sharp, ringing crack, and for a fraction of a second the entire system seemed to hesitate, as though the sequence had been interrupted at a critical point. The wardkeeper reacted instantly. Its free hand seized Adrian by the front of his coat with crushing force, lifting him from the ground as though he weighed nothing at all, and as he struggled against the grip, he saw the metal face tilt slightly, the dark slits aligning once more with his own eyes. There was no anger there, no frustration, only purpose. The key rose again. Behind them, the lock below shuddered, its spinning keys striking one another with a rising, chaotic rhythm that no longer resembled ordered motion, while the golden dust pouring from the chamber thickened into a storm that whipped across the platform in blinding spirals. "Adrian!" Ragnok shouted. But Adrian could not answer, because the pressure returned, stronger than before, pressing inward from all sides, and as the wardkeeper forced the key downward once more, Adrian felt something shift within him, something small, something buried, something that responded to the same ancient system that governed the vaults and locks and mechanisms below Gringotts. The crimson line flared again. This time it did not stop at his boots. It passed through him. The wardkeeper froze. The key hovered inches from the hidden lock. And in the air between them, written in burning letters that formed from the swirling dust itself, appeared words that changed everything. Clearance partial. Human interface detected. The words did not fade at once, because they burned in the air with a steady and unnatural clarity. Each letter suspended within the swirling golden dust, as though held there by the same ancient authority that governed the locks and wards of the deep vaults. And as Adrian hung in the iron grip of the wardkeeper, his coat twisted in its unyielding grasp, he felt the meaning of those words settle upon him, not merely as information, but as a condition that had already begun to alter the course of events around him. The pressure within his chest returned, stronger now, not painful, but insistent, as though some hidden mechanism had begun to turn in response to his presence. And though he could not see it, he sensed that whatever lay beneath the foundation chambers was no longer dormant, but reacting, aligning itself to a pattern that now included him. "Release him," Ragnok commanded, his voice cutting sharply through the rising noise of the cavern. The wardkeeper did not obey. Instead, its grip tightened fractionally. Not enough to crush, but enough to assert control, while the key in its other hand lowered slowly, carefully, as though guided by a precision far beyond simple mechanical action, until it hovered once more above the smaller keyhole set into the stone at the base of the great door. "Do not let it complete the sequence," Ragnok said, though there was something in his tone that suggested he already feared they were too late. Adrian forced himself to think through the haze of pressure and motion, because the appearance of the words had confirmed what he had only begun to suspect, which was that the system beneath Gringotts did not simply recognize goblin authority, but could, under certain conditions, extend that recognition in part to others, and that such recognition was not granted randomly, but triggered by specific interactions, by knowledge, by proximity, perhaps even by intention. "Ragnok," he said. His voice strained but clear. "It cannot use the key without alignment." The goblin's eyes snapped to him. "Explain." "The first lock rejected it," Adrian continued, speaking quickly now, because he felt the moment slipping. "The second lock requires something else, something that matches the system beyond the key itself, and it is trying to use me as that match." Ragnok's expression darkened. "You are saying it needs you." "I am saying it needs what it detected in me," Adrian corrected, because the distinction mattered, though he did not yet fully understand why. The wardkeeper lowered the key another fraction. The tip touched the edge of the hidden keyhole. The air seemed to hold its breath. Then the pressure surged. Adrian gasped as the sensation within his chest intensified into something far more focused, as though a point of contact had been established between him and the mechanism beyond the door, and for a fleeting instant his vision blurred, replaced by a cascade of images that were not his own. Fragments of stone corridors, sealed chambers, ancient symbols etched into black metal, and beneath it all, the slow, relentless turning of something vast that extended far beyond the limits of the cavern in which he stood. He saw the lock below from within. He saw its chains descending into darkness without end. He saw the keys spinning, each one tied to a point within the system, each one a part of a greater whole. And he understood. "Stop," he said, his voice suddenly sharp with clarity. The wardkeeper paused. The key remained where it was, neither advancing nor retreating. Ragnok seized the moment. "How?" Adrian forced the words out through the pressure. "The key is not opening the door," he said. "It is selecting a function within the system, and the wrong function was triggered above." Ragnok's eyes narrowed. "The lock below." "Yes," Adrian said, the understanding solidifying as he spoke. "The main door connects to the lock below, which is why it failed, because the system recognized the key but rejected the sequence, and now it is trying to access a secondary function through the lower interface." "The hidden keyhole," Ragnok said. Adrian nodded as much as the grip allowed. "But the system requires a second element, something that confirms the command is valid, and that is what it detected in me." Ragnok's voice dropped. "What element?" Adrian swallowed. "I do not know." That uncertainty hung heavy, because it meant that though they now understood the structure of the problem, they still lacked the means to control it. And as the wardkeeper resumed its motion, pressing the key slowly into alignment with the hidden lock, Adrian felt the pressure rise again, pulling at whatever unseen connection had been established. Then, from somewhere deep within his mind, a memory surfaced. The golden dust, the forming letters, the patterns of recognition. And beneath it all, the words that had appeared when the first case opened. Zero clearance. Not a level of access. A denial of it. No clearance, Adrian whispered. Ragnok's gaze sharpened. What did you say? "Zero clearance," Adrian said, forcing the words into the open as the key began to descend once more. "It does not mean highest access. It means no access at all, a complete denial, a state in which the system refuses all commands, even those it would normally obey." Ragnok stared at him. "Then why create such a designation?" Adrian's answer came as the realization locked into place. As a failsafe. The key slid into the hidden lock. The pressure surged to its peak. The symbols along the door flared in blinding light. And in that instant, Adrian shouted the only command that made sense. "Override with zero clearance." For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then everything did. The light collapsed inward, not outward, drawn back into the carved symbols as though consumed by an invisible force, and the spinning keys within the lock below faltered, their chaotic motion stuttering into uneven bursts before slowing abruptly, while the golden dust froze in mid-air, each particle suspended as though time itself had hesitated. The wardkeeper jerked violently. The key locked in place. And once more, the air filled with burning letters. "Clearance 0. System lockdown initiated." The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The great door slammed shut with a force that shook the entire cavern, cutting off the view of the lock below in an instant, while the bridges beneath their feet steadied as the turning rings slowed to a heavy, deliberate crawl, and the crimson lines along the platform extinguished one by one until only the dim glow of the goblins' weapons remained. The wardkeeper released Adrian. Not by choice, but by command. It stepped back, its movements jerking, halting, as though its internal directives had been overridden, and for a moment it stood motionless, the key still embedded in the hidden lock, before its head tilted sharply to one side. Then it spoke. The sound that emerged was not a voice in the human sense, nor even the harsh tones of gobbledygook, but something layered, mechanical, and ancient, as though multiple voices spoke through a single channel that had not been used for centuries. "Zero clearance acknowledged," it said. "All functions suspended." Ragnok did not lower his weapon. "What are you?" he demanded. The wardkeeper's head shifted again, the metal face catching the dim light in fractured reflections. "Guardian Protocol," it replied. "Foundation Grid." Adrian pushed himself to his feet, his body still trembling from the strain of the connection, yet his mind clearer now than it had been since they entered the lower vaults. "You were not opening the lock below," he said. The wardkeeper did not deny it. "Access required," it said. "Sequence incomplete." "For what purpose?" Ragnok pressed. There was a pause, as though the system itself weighed the question. Then the answer came, and with it the final revelation of the conflict they had been chasing through the depths of Gringotts. "Containment breach detected," the wardkeeper said. "Foundation failure imminent. Primary objective, restore access to lock below." Adrian felt the weight of those words settle into place. "You were trying to lock it again," he said. "Yes." The silence that followed was not one of relief, but of deeper, more unsettling understanding, because it meant that everything they had seen, every opened vault, every moving mechanism, every triggered system, had not been the act of something seeking to release what lay below, but of something struggling to prevent that release. And that meant one thing above all. "Then something else is down there," Adrian said slowly. The wardkeeper's head turned toward the sealed door. "Yes," it said. The single word echoed through the cavern like a sentence pronounced. And somewhere beyond that closed barrier, something vast shifted in the dark. For a long and heavy moment no one spoke, because the truth that had just been revealed did not bring relief, but rather deepened the danger into something far more complex than any of them had anticipated. And as Adrian stood upon the trembling platform, with the echoes of the system lockdown still reverberating through the cavern, he felt the weight of the situation shift from pursuit to containment, from stopping an intruder to confronting a failure that had already begun long before they had even been summoned. Ragnok lowered his weapon slowly, though not entirely, because caution was now more necessary than ever, and his gaze remained fixed upon the sealed foundation door, as though he could sense the presence beyond it, even through layers of stone and ancient wards. "You said containment breach," he said to the ward keeper, his voice steady but edged with something darker. "Explain." The ward keeper did not move, yet the faint glow within the seams of its armor pulsed once, as if acknowledging the command. And when it spoke again, the layered tone of its voice carried an unsettling clarity, as though the suspension of its primary function had freed it to communicate more fully. "Foundation grid integrity compromised," it said. "Containment protocols initiated. Primary seal unresponsive. Secondary seal requires dual authorization." Adrian felt the meaning strike him before the full explanation had even been given, because the pattern was already clear in his mind, and the pieces that had once seemed scattered now aligned into a single, unavoidable conclusion. "The lock below is not the only barrier," he said quietly. Ragnok turned his head slightly. "No," Adrian continued, his voice gaining strength as the realization took hold. "It is only the primary one, and if it fails, there must be another system designed to reinforce it." "Secondary seal," Ragnok said, repeating the term with a grim understanding. The wardkeeper inclined its head. "Correct." The cavern seemed to grow colder. "And the key," Adrian said, gesturing toward the hidden lock where the glowing object remained embedded, "is part of that system." "Yes." Ragnok's gaze sharpened. "Then why did you attempt to open the primary lock first?" There was a pause, longer this time, as though the wardkeeper were retrieving something from deep within its own directives. "Original sequence required," it said at last. "Primary seal must be accessed before secondary authorization can be engaged." "Oh," Adrian exhaled slowly. "So you followed the sequence as it was designed, even though the primary seal was already compromised?" "Yes." "And when it failed," Adrian continued, "you attempted to move to the secondary system, but you could not complete the authorization without a second element." The wardkeeper's response came without hesitation. "Correct." Ragnok's expression darkened. "And that second element is not goblin." The wardkeeper turned its head slightly toward Adrian. "Human interface detected." The words settled heavily, because they confirmed what Adrian had already begun to suspect, that whatever ancient system governed the foundation chambers had not been built for goblins alone, but had been designed with a dual structure, one that required both goblin and human interaction to fully operate, a fact that carried implications far beyond the immediate crisis. "Why would such a system exist?" Adrian asked, though he already feared the answer. Ragnok did not look at him when he spoke. "Because there were things even goblins chose not to control alone." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken history, and Adrian understood that whatever lay beneath them had once required cooperation between two worlds that rarely trusted one another, and that the system had been built not merely to contain, but to ensure that no single side could access it without the other. "And now," Adrian said slowly, "the system is trying to repair itself, but it cannot complete the sequence without both parts." "Yes," said the wardkeeper. a low rumble passed through the cavern. Not the steady turning of the rings. Something deeper. Something slower. Adrian felt it through the soles of his boots, a vibration that seemed to rise from far below, pressing upward through the stone as though something immense had shifted in response to the partial lockdown. Ragnar's head snapped toward the sealed door. "It is still active," he said. The wardkeeper did not deny it. "Containment unstable." Adrian's mind raced. "Then the lockdown is not enough." "No," the wardkeeper confirmed. "Then we have to complete the sequence," Adrian said, the conclusion forming with dreadful clarity. Ragnar turned sharply. "You propose to open the secondary seal?" "I propose to close what is failing below," Adrian replied, meeting his gaze without hesitation, because the logic was unavoidable. If the primary system is compromised, and the secondary system requires both of us, then we are the only ones who can restore full containment. Ragnar's expression hardened. "And if the process fails?" Adrian did not look away. "Then whatever is below us will not remain below." The truth of that hung in the air like a blade. The wardkeeper shifted, its movement still restrained by the zero clearance command, yet not entirely inert, and the faint glow within its armor pulsed again, as though responding to the rising instability in the system. "Time limit approaching," it said. Adrian turned toward it. "How long?" The answer came without hesitation. "Unknown." Ragnar gave a sharp, humorless breath. "Of course." Adrian stepped closer to the sealed door, studying the surface where the hidden lock lay, and though the light had faded, he could still see the faint outline of the key embedded within it, and around it the carved symbols that had flared so brightly moments before. "If we remove the key," he said slowly, "the lockdown ends." "Yes," the wardkeeper confirmed. "And if we leave it," Adrian continued, "the system remains frozen, but the breach below continues to grow." "Yes." Ragnar's voice was low. "So we are given a choice between two failures." Adrian nodded once. "Unless we complete the sequence correctly." The goblin looked at him for a long moment, weighing not only the risk, but the necessity. And in that silence, Adrian understood that the decision before them wasn't merely tactical, but fundamental, because it required them to trust a system they barely understood, to follow a process that had already shown itself capable of error, and to place themselves directly between whatever lay below and the world above. "You said the secondary seal requires dual authorization," Ragnar said at last. "Yes." "Then we proceed together," the goblin said. Adrian inclined his head. "Yes." The wardkeeper turned its head slightly, as though acknowledging the alignment of intent. "Sequence may be resumed," it said, "awaiting input." Adrian reached towards the key. Ragnar stepped beside him. For a brief moment, both hesitated, because the act of touching that object again would end the only safety they currently possessed, imperfect as it was, and would place them directly into the flow of a system that had already begun to awaken after centuries of silence. Then Adrian spoke, his voice quiet but certain. "The conflict is clear," he said. "Either we act now and attempt to restore the system, or we wait and allow it to fail completely." Ragnar gave a single, decisive nod. "Then we act." Together they reached for the key. And as their hands closed around it, the cavern trembled once more, stronger than before, as though whatever lay beneath the foundation chambers had felt the shift and was preparing to answer it. The instant their hands touched the key, the stillness imposed by zero clearance broke like thin ice under weight, and the hidden lock answered not with light alone, but with a deep metallic shudder that ran through the platform, down into the turning rings below, and outward along every carved line in the stone, until the entire cavern seemed to awaken in layered sequence, one ancient mechanism after another, receiving the same silent command and rising from suspension into grim obedience. Adrian felt the force of it pass through his arm and into his chest, where that strange pressure returned at once, no longer probing now, but connecting, establishing a channel so direct and undeniable that for a few breathless seconds he could not tell whether he was merely touching the system or whether the system had, in some ancient and terrible fashion, laid hold of him in return, while beside him Ragnok stiffened visibly, his jaw tightening as the runes set into the key flared beneath their joined hands with a steady gold-white fire. The wardkeeper stepped back. Its voice, when it came, was no longer strained by interruption or overridden command, but had settled into the formal cadence of something executing a purpose older than memory. "Dual authorization recognized," it said. "Secondary containment sequence available." The great door at the center of the platform did not open this time, nor did the lock below reveal itself again, because instead the stone beneath Adrian's boots shifted with a grinding motion that sent the goblin guards snapping into alert stances, weapons raised, as a circular section of the platform slowly descended by several inches and then split along a seam no wider than a knife edge, opening to reveal a staircase winding down into a shaft of darkness where no lantern had ever burned. Cold air rose from it. Not the dry, dead chill of old vaults, but something deeper and stranger, carrying the smell of ancient metal, sealed chambers, and a faint trace of water that had never touched open air. Ragnok removed his hand from the key first, though Adrian noticed that the goblin did so with effort. As though reluctant to break a link he did not trust, but dared not abandon carelessly. "This was beneath the platform all along," Adrian said, more quietly than he intended. Ragnok's expression remained hard. "Many things are beneath other things in Gringotts." The answer was dry, but it did not hide the gravity of the moment. The wardkeeper turned toward the opening staircase. "Secondary seal access corridor," it said. "Time-sensitive." That was enough. Ragnok signaled sharply, and the guards reformed around them at once, though more tightly now, as if instinct rather than order told them that whatever lay below required a different kind of caution than anything above, and together they began the descent into the shaft beneath the platform, leaving behind the bridges, the turning rings, and the half-seen grandeur of the foundation door for a passage narrower, darker, and far more intimate in its danger. The steps were steep and old. Not worn by traffic, because Adrian suspected almost no one had ever used them, but polished in places by time itself, as though the stone had slowly surrendered its edges to the pressure of the centuries. The walls here were close enough that Adrian could trail his fingertips along them if he wished, yet he did not. Because the carved symbols set into the rock were deeper and stranger than any he had seen thus far, and though he could not read them, he felt with increasing certainty that they were not warnings in the ordinary sense, but instructions, laws, and prohibitions woven together in a language designed less for speech than for command. Below them the shaft widened suddenly, opening into a circular chamber so perfectly proportioned that Adrian stopped despite himself, because it gave the disorienting impression not of being built, but of having been measured into existence with such precision that every angle, every curve, every seam in the stone served a purpose beyond architecture. and at the center of that chamber stood a structure unlike any vault or mechanism he had yet seen. It was a basin, or rather, it resembled one at first glance, a wide ring of black metal set into the floor and filled not with water, but with a smooth, lightless surface that seemed to absorb reflection rather than cast it, while above it hung 3 chains descending from the unseen ceiling, each attached to a separate armature of gold and iron, poised over the dark center, as though waiting for something to be placed there. Around the basin, set at equal intervals in the stone, were 12 narrow recesses shaped unmistakably like keyholes. But only one key was present. The one Adrian and Ragnok had just used now lay upon a bracket beside the nearest recess, where neither of them had placed it. Adrian stared. It moved. "Yes," said the wardkeeper. That answer settled nothing. Ragnok stepped closer to the basin without crossing the circular ring around it, his eyes moving from chain to armature to keyhole recess, with a concentration that told Adrian he wasn't seeing these things for the first time in concept, but perhaps for the first time in reality. "The secondary seal," Adrian said. Ragnok inclined his head once. "So it seems." The wardkeeper took its place at the far side of the chamber and went still. "Sequence instructions available upon request." "Then give them," Ragnok said at once. The creature's metal face turned fractionally toward the basin. "Secondary seal restores pressure balance beneath primary containment. 12 anchor locks, 1 available key. 2 operators required, 1 to guide, 1 to witness." Adrian frowned. "That makes no sense. 12 locks and 1 key?" The wardkeeper answered in the same even tone. "Single key. Sequential use. Incorrect order causes seal fracture." A silence followed that was made worse by the low sound beginning to rise from beneath the chamber floor, for at first Adrian thought it was only another distant movement from the machinery above. But then he realized that this noise was wetter, heavier, less like metal, and more like the slow displacement of something vast forcing itself through confined space far below. Ragnok heard it too. "How much time?" he asked. "Unknown," said the wardkeeper. Ragnok closed his eyes for the briefest moment, then opened them again, with decision sharpened into something almost hard enough to cut. "What does guiding require?" The wardkeeper lifted one long hand and pointed not to the key, but to Adrian. "Human interface." Adrian felt the chamber seem to tilt slightly around him, not in truth, but in the mind's instinctive protest against being named essential in a place no human was ever meant to stand. "And the witness?" he asked, though he already knew. "Goblin authorization," said the wardkeeper, turning to Ragnok. Ragnok's expression did not change. "Of course." Adrian stepped nearer the basin, studying the 12 recesses, noticing now that each was marked above with one of the carved symbols repeated from the corridors, though here the marks were clearer, more formal, each enclosed within a fine circle of inlaid silver that gleamed faintly as the chamber's own hidden light shifted beneath the surface of the dark basin. "Guide means I choose the order," Adrian said. "Yes." "Based on what?" The wardkeeper's answer came without sympathy. "Recognition." Adrian nearly laughed, though there was no humor in him at all. "That is not instruction." "It is sufficient," the creature replied. Ragnok looked from the recesses to Adrian. "What do you see?" At first, Adrian saw only symbols. Then, as he forced himself to breathe slowly and let the earlier connection return rather than resist it, something subtle changed, because the pressure inside his chest rose again, gentler this time, and the symbols around the basin began to differentiate themselves, not glowing, not moving, but acquiring weight in his perception, as though some were nearer to alignment and others farther from it, while the dark surface at the center remained utterly still, holding no reflection, no light, no hint of depth. He pointed to the first recess on the left. That one. Ragnok did not question him. He took the key from its bracket, inserted it into the marked recess, and turned. The result was immediate. One of the 3 hanging chains above the basin drew taut with a heavy clank, and the dark surface in the center rippled once, outward from no visible point, before settling again into perfect stillness. "First anchor engaged," said the wardkeeper. Adrian exhaled. 11 remained. The sound beneath the floor grew louder. He closed his eyes for one heartbeat, reached again for that half-felt alignment between himself and the chamber, and when he opened them, a second recess seemed to pull at his attention not by sight, but by certainty, a quiet rightness amid the others. "There," he said. Ragnok moved at once. The key turned. A second chain tightened. This time the basin did not merely ripple. Something moved beneath its surface. Not up toward them, but across, like a shadow passing deep below black water. Adrian stepped back on instinct. "What was that?" The wardkeeper answered without pause. "Pressure displacement." Yet its voice, for the first time, seemed almost too quick, as though the truth had been selected for usefulness rather than completeness. Ragnok heard it too. "You are withholding information." "Sequence integrity prioritized," the wardkeeper said. The goblin's mouth hardened. Adrian pointed to the third recess. The key turned again. The third anchor engaged. And from far below, through layers of stone and metal and ancient containment, there came a sound like something enormous striking once, deliberately, against the underside of the world. The sound did not echo in the ordinary way, because it seemed to travel not through the air alone, but through the stone itself, rising from the depths in a slow and dreadful resonance that settled into the bones rather than fading into silence. And as Adrian stood beside the dark basin with the third anchor now engaged, he felt that whatever lay beneath them had not merely shifted, but had taken notice, as though the act of restoring the secondary seal had reached down into its confinement and touched it directly. No one spoke for several seconds, because even the goblins, whose discipline had carried them through vaults, breaches, and ancient mechanisms, now stood with a stillness that bordered on tension, their weapons lowered not out of safety but out of instinct, as though striking at this moment would be both useless and unwise. And Ragnok's eyes remained fixed upon the basin where the surface, once smooth and empty, now held faint disturbances that moved too slowly to be ripples and too deliberately to be random. "Continue," he said at last, his voice quiet but unyielding. Adrian did not hesitate, though he felt the strain building within him, because the connection that allowed him to sense the correct sequence was growing stronger with each anchor engaged, and that strength did not come without cost, for the pressure in his chest had deepened into something that felt almost like weight, as though the system beneath them was drawing more from him with every correct choice, not in a way that weakened him directly, but in a way that bound him more tightly to its function. He turned his gaze across the remaining recesses, forcing himself to focus despite the low rumble that now continued beneath the chamber floor, a steady, rising undertone that suggested movement far below, vast and persistent. And after a moment, the next point of alignment became clear. Not through sight, but through the same quiet certainty that had guided him before. "There," he said. Ragnok moved. The key slid into the fourth recess, turned, and locked with a heavy click that reverberated through the chamber, and at once the fourth chain above the basin tightened, though Adrian had not noticed its presence before, because it had hung higher than the others, nearly invisible against the dark ceiling, and as it drew taut, the basin reacted more violently than before, its surface breaking into concentric distortions that spread outward and then inward again, as though something below had pressed upward against it and been forced back by the reassertion of the seal. The wardkeeper spoke. "Fourth anchor engaged. Pressure stabilization partial." "Partial is not enough," Ragnok said. "No," the wardkeeper agreed. Adrian swallowed, because he could feel the urgency increasing not just in the chamber, but within the system itself, as though each correct step they took was met by resistance from below, a push against the closing of the seals that grew stronger with every moment. He pointed again. The fifth anchor. Then the sixth. Each one engaged with the same heavy finality, each one tightening the unseen structure that held the containment in place. And with each turn of the key, the disturbances in the basin grew more violent, the shadow beneath its surface moving faster now, pressing against the boundary with increasing force, as though aware that its window of opportunity was closing. By the seventh anchor, the chamber itself began to tremble. Dust fell in thin streams from the carved ceiling. The chains rattled despite their tension, and from far below came a second impact, heavier than the first, followed by a sound that was not quite a roar, not quite a grinding of stone, but something between the two, a deep, sustained pressure that seemed to test the limits of the containment from within. Adrian faltered. Not physically, but mentally, because for the first time the pattern before him blurred, the sense of alignment disrupted by the growing interference from below, and for a moment he could not distinguish one recess from another, each symbol seeming equally valid, equally possible, as though the system itself were being strained to the point where its clarity began to fracture. "I cannot see it," he said. The admission forced from him, despite his effort to hold it back. Ragnok turned sharply. "Then find another way." Adrian closed his eyes. Not to withdraw, but to concentrate, because he understood that the guidance he had been relying upon was no longer enough on its own, and that if he continued to follow it blindly, the risk of error would grow with each step, and a single mistake now would not simply delay them, but would fracture the entire sequence and render their effort meaningless. He forced his thoughts back to the beginning. The vault. The key. The failure at the primary lock. The correction at the secondary. The concept of zero clearance. Denial as protection. And then, slowly, the pattern returned, not as sensation, but as logic. A structure underlying the sequence that had been obscured by the immediacy of the connection. "It is not random," he said, opening his eyes again. "It follows a symmetry." Ragnok frowned. "Explain." "The anchors are not independent," Adrian continued, his voice steadying as the understanding took shape. "They balance each other, distributing pressure across the containment grid, and the order must reflect that balance, not simply the strength of each point." Ragnok's gaze shifted to the basin. Then the next anchor must counter the last. "Yes," Adrian said, and as he looked again at the remaining recesses, the pattern aligned once more, clearer now, more stable. "There." The eighth anchor engaged. The basin convulsed. The shadow beneath its surface surged upward, pressing so close that for an instant Adrian thought it would break through, its shape indistinct yet vast, filling the dark with a presence that defied scale, and though it did not breach the surface, the force of its movement sent a shock through the chamber that nearly drove Adrian to his knees. Ragnok caught him by the arm, steadying him. "Hold," the goblin said. "I am," Adrian replied, though his voice strained under the effort. 2 more anchors. Then 1. Then the last. Each step brought them closer to completion, yet each step also provoked a stronger response from below, as though whatever was contained beneath the foundation chambers understood now that it was being sealed away once more and resisted with everything it possessed. By the 10th anchor, the chamber was shaking continuously. By the 11th, the chains screamed under tension. And as Adrian pointed to the final recess, the 12th and last anchor required to complete the sequence, the basin erupted into violent motion, the surface breaking apart into a storm of dark fragments that spun and collided like shards of liquid night, while from beneath came a final, colossal impact that made the entire structure shudder as though it might collapse inward at any moment. Ragnok looked at him. "This is the last." Adrian nodded, though his vision swam and his chest felt as though it were bound in iron. "If we get it wrong," he said quietly, "there is no second attempt." Ragnok did not hesitate. "Then we do not get it wrong." The key was placed. It turned, and for a fraction of a second, nothing happened at all. Then the chamber went silent. Not gradually. Completely. The motion of the basin ceased, the chains stilled. The rumble below cut off as though severed. And the darkness at the center of the basin became perfectly smooth once more, as though nothing had ever disturbed it. The wardkeeper spoke. "Secondary seal complete. Containment restored." Adrian exhaled slowly, the tension draining from him in a wave so sudden that he had to brace himself against the stone to remain standing. And for a moment he allowed himself to believe that it was over, that the system had been repaired, that whatever lay beneath them had been secured once more within the ancient mechanisms designed to hold it. Then the basin moved again. Not violently. Not with force. But with a slow, deliberate ripple that spread outward from the center, and as Adrian stared into its dark surface, something rose into view, not breaking through, but becoming visible beneath the black, a shape vast and shifting, its outline too large to comprehend fully, yet unmistakably present. Watching. And as the realization struck him, the wardkeeper's voice came once more, quieter now, almost subdued. "Containment restored," it said again. But this time, there was something in the tone that made Adrian understand the truth behind the words. Restored did not mean resolved. And whatever lay below knew exactly where they were. For several long heartbeats, no one moved, because the shape beneath the basin did not thrash or strike or test the restored seal again, but remained there in that impossible dark with a stillness more terrible than violence, as though it had drawn near not in rage, but in awareness. And Adrian, who had spent the entire descent believing that the danger below Gringotts was some blind force of pressure and ruin, understood at last that whatever the lock below had been built to restrain was not merely powerful, but conscious, and that the restored containment had not ended the conflict so much as brought it to its final, most intimate moment. The smooth black surface of the basin held the outline only for an instant longer, though that instant stretched in Adrian's mind until it seemed far longer than it could truly have been, because the impression of scale was so unnatural that his thoughts could not quite contain it. And when the ripple faded and the shape receded once more into unreadable depth, the chamber felt emptier than before. Not safer, but quieter in the way a room becomes quiet after something has spoken and chosen not to speak again. Ragnok was the first to break that stillness. "Is the seal holding?" he asked. The wardkeeper stood at the far side of the chamber, its armor dark now except for a few faint seams of gold at the joints, and when it answered, the layered voice seemed less mechanical than it had before, perhaps because the immediate violence of its function had ceased, or perhaps because Adrian now heard in it the remains of an old intention rather than a simple command. "Secondary containment stable," it said. "Primary containment impaired. Total restraint restored within acceptable tolerance." Ragnok's mouth tightened. Acceptable tolerance is not a phrase that inspires comfort. "No," said the wardkeeper, and for the first time there was almost something like agreement in its tone. Adrian straightened slowly, though the weight in his chest had not fully lifted, because some fragment of the interface remained with him still, a dull echo of pressure that seemed to linger behind his breathing. And as he looked again at the 12 anchor recesses around the basin, at the single key now resting motionless in the final lock, and at the chains above drawn taut as if holding an unseen architecture in place beneath the floor, he began to understand the shape of the ending that had to come. "This cannot remain like this forever," he said. Ragnok turned toward him. "No." "The primary seal is damaged," Adrian continued. "The secondary seal is restored, but only as reinforcement. That means the system below Gringotts is still wounded." Ragnok gave a short nod. "And wounded systems fail eventually." The truth of that hung plainly between them, stripped of drama by its own simplicity. One of the goblin guards stepped nearer the basin, though not too near, his weapon lowered now but still ready. "What is it?" he asked quietly, and though the question was directed at no one in particular, it seemed to settle upon the chamber itself, because each of them knew that the answer mattered, and that none of them wanted to hear it. Ragnok looked at the wardkeeper. The wardkeeper did not hesitate. "Designation lost," it said. "Original record sealed under Foundation law. Current classification, 0 clearance." Adrian exhaled softly through his nose. "So even now," he said, "the system refuses access to its identity." "Oh, yes." That, strangely, made sense to him, because a name gave form, and form gave leverage, and whatever had been hidden here had been hidden so thoroughly that even knowledge of it had been made part of the containment. Ragnok's eyes narrowed slightly. "Can the primary seal be repaired?" A pause followed. Then the wardkeeper answered, "Not from this chamber." "From where, then?" "Upper grid, Foundation relay, 3 access points." Adrian felt a grim kind of relief at the clarity of it, because at last the problem was becoming something solid rather than endless mystery. "So the outcome is this," he said, turning to Ragnok as much as to himself. "We stopped the breach. We restored the secondary seal. The thing below remains contained. But the system above is damaged, and unless those relay points are repaired, this will happen again." Ragnok held his gaze for a long moment. "Yes," the goblin said, "that is the truth of it." There, at last, was the resolved shape of the story that had begun with an opened vault and an absent key, because the conflict had never truly been about theft, nor sabotage, nor rebellion within the bank, but about a failing defense hidden beneath centuries of secrecy. And now that defense had been stabilized, though not healed, which meant the night had been saved even if the deeper labor remained to be done. The wardkeeper moved toward the basin. Every goblin in the chamber tensed at once, but the creature did not touch the black surface, nor attempt to alter the anchors. Because instead it raised one long hand above the center and held it there as though listening to some frequency too deep for the others to hear. After a moment it said, "Below awareness reduced, response withdrawn." Adrian felt the last knot in his shoulders loosen by a fraction. "It knows it cannot get through." The wardkeeper lowered its hand. "Correct." Ragnok glanced toward the stair by which they had descended. "Then we leave now." Yet Adrian did not move at once, because there was still one thing not understood, one turn in the path that had carried them all the way here. "Why me?" he asked. Ragnok looked back. The wardkeeper turned its metal face toward him. "Human interface detected through contact resonance," it said. "Legacy condition." Adrian frowned. "That explains nothing." The wardkeeper continued in its steady, ancient voice. "Foundation system built under dual-authored treaty architecture. Goblin witness, human guide, interface activates in presence of qualifying cognition." Ragnok's expression darkened thoughtfully. "Qualifying cognition," he repeated. Adrian looked from one to the other. "You mean it responded because I understood the pattern?" "Yes," said the wardkeeper. It was such a simple answer that it almost angered him, because after all the danger, all the descent, all the pressure and fear, the truth was not bloodline, prophecy, or hidden heritage, but something much plainer and far more grounded. He had seen the system clearly enough to be recognized by it. Ragnok studied him with a new and unreadable expression. "So that is why the old builders allowed for human guidance," he said quietly. "Not trust, not status, comprehension." Adrian gave a tired, humorless breath. "That seems an inconvenient quality to discover in the middle of a crisis." "It was useful," said Ragnok, which, from a goblin, felt almost like gratitude. The key released itself from the 12th recess with a clean metallic click and rose an inch into the air, held there by no visible force, before drifting back toward the bracket beside the basin, where it settled into place as neatly as though invisible hands had returned it home. And one by one, the circles around the anchor recesses dimmed, until only the black center remained dark and still. "Sequence concluded," said the wardkeeper. Ragnok gestured for the guards to withdraw first, and they did so with visible relief held firmly beneath their discipline, climbing back toward the hidden stair while casting only the briefest glances over their shoulders, because none of them wished to be the last to turn away from the basin, and Adrian could not blame them. For he too felt the pull of leaving this chamber before the silence within it had time to deepen again into something worse. He followed Ragnok up the stair. The climb felt longer than the descent had been, perhaps because tension was giving way to exhaustion, or perhaps because the knowledge of what lay below now gave weight to every step upward. And when at last they emerged once more into the platform chamber, with its great rings of metal turning in slow, controlled motion beneath the bridges, Adrian paused and looked back down into the darkness of the stairwell before the hidden seam closed over it, erasing all sign that the way had ever existed. The foundation door remained sealed. The symbols across it were dark. The lock below was hidden once more. Ragnok stood beside him in silence for several seconds, then said, "What happened here does not leave this level without agreement." "Whoa," Adrian glanced at him. "You called the ministry." "I called for help," said Ragnok, That is not the same as confession. Adrian might have argued on another night, under another sky, in another kind of danger, but now he understood too well why Gringotts had buried this truth beneath law, stone, and silence, because panic above ground would solve nothing, and careless knowledge would only weaken what had just barely been restored. The ministry will need something, he said. It will receive something, Ragnarok replied. A breach contained, systems stabilized, further goblin review pending. Adrian gave a weary nod. It was not the whole truth, but it was enough truth for the world above, and perhaps enough was all that safety ever really allowed. They crossed the bridges, passed back through the chambers of the Foundation grid, climbed the spiral stair, moved through the sealed passage where the ancient wards seemed quieter now, as though the stone itself had relaxed from the strain of nearly failing in its duty, and by the time they reached the upper shaft again, the ordinary sounds of Gringotts had begun to return in distant fragments. The hum of carts, the scrape of metal, the disciplined movement of goblins restoring what could be restored before dawn ever touched Diagon Alley. At the lower landing, where the black case still sat abandoned in the cart, Ragnarok stopped and turned to Adrian. The goblin's face revealed little. As always, yet there was a firmness in his gaze that felt altered from their first meeting. "You saw what few outside my kind have ever seen," he said. "You helped prevent a failure older than your ministry. For that, Gringotts is in your debt." Adrian blinked once, because he had not expected to hear those words from any goblin, least of all this one. "I imagine the debt will not be written down." "No," said Ragnarok. "It will not." And somehow that made it feel more real. When Adrian finally stepped out into the great hall of Gringotts again, the chandeliers seemed too bright, the marble too clean, the ordered rows of counters too calm for the world that existed beneath them, and witches and wizards moved in and out of the bank with bags, ledgers, keys, and complaints, never guessing that far below their feet, an ancient system had nearly failed and been held shut again only by the narrowest margin. Outside, Diagon Alley was beginning to pale with the first suggestion of morning. Shop signs creaked softly. Owl wings stirred somewhere above the rooftops. The world, indifferent and intact, continued. Adrian paused on the steps and looked back once at the white stone facade of Gringotts, and though nothing on its surface had changed, he knew that he would never see it as merely a bank again. Because now he understood that it was also a lid, a wall, a promise carved into the earth and paid for by secrecy, vigilance, and old agreements that still held meaning in the dark. Behind him, the great doors opened once more. Ragnarok emerged just far enough to speak. "There will be repairs," he said. "When the relay points are addressed, a message will find you." Adrian gave him a tired, half smile. "I was afraid you might say that." Ragnarok's mouth twitched, not quite into amusement, but near enough. Then he withdrew, and the doors of Gringotts closed again with quiet finality. Adrian stood alone in the early light for a moment longer before turning toward the ministry, already shaping in his mind the careful report he would give, one true enough to satisfy, incomplete enough to protect, and heavy enough to remind him that some victories were not loud, glorious, or widely known, but were won in silence beneath the world, where the only reward was that dawn arrived exactly as it should. And far below, behind locks restored and seals renewed, the thing without a name remained where it belonged, aware, waiting, and unable to rise. For now, that was enough. The breach had been contained. The key had been returned. The conflict had been resolved. and Gringotts once more held.
Ну що, з вами Саламандр. Найбільше, знаєте, ці історії чіпляє не сам таємничий замок у надрах Грінготса і не древній механізм, а той момент, коли Адріан зрозумів, що більше не може залишатися просто спостерігачем. Він міг відпустити, міг дозволити іншим вирішити проблему, але замість цього погодився стати частиною небезпечного процесу, який міг коштувати йому дуже дорого. І саме тут ховається важливий урок. Ми часто захоплюємося людьми, які беруть на себе відповідальність, які знаходять рішення або рятують ситуацію. Але рідко замислюємося про ціну, яку вони платять за це. В цій історії Адріан отримав не славу і не нагороду. Він віддав свій спокій, свою безпеку і навіть певненість у тому, що все закінчиться добре. Здається, що в реальному житті найцінніші вчинки майже завжди мають приховану ціну. І якщо ми бачимо когось, хто робить правильну річ, варто пам'ятати, можливо, ця людина пожертвувала значно більше, ніж видно ззовні. Іноді справжня мудрість – це не перемога, іноді це готовність заплатити необхідну ціну за те, щоб інші могли залишатися в безпеці. З вами був Саламандр. Бережіть у собі цю здатність бачити не лише результат, а й жертву, яка стоїть за ним.